All right, guys, we're going to continue and finish our video series on classical India and China. And we're finishing it here with part 3, which is going to be about the Han emperors in China. And this basically, guys, is going to do a really good summary of what the classical age was like in China. So, under a man named Shi Huangdi, the Qin dynasty, that's Qin, Qin, had unified China. Shi Huangdi established a strong government by conquering the rival kings who ruled small states throughout China. After Shi Huangdi died in 210 BC, his son proved to be a weak, ineffective leader. China's government would fall apart. So then we're going to move to the Han dynasty. And that's what we're talking about, guys. It's the classical age in China, beginning with the Han. Rumblings of discontent during the Qin dynasty grew to roars in the years after Shi Huangdi's death. Peasants were bitter over years of high taxes, harsh labor, quotas, and a severe penal system. They rebelled. Rival kings were eager to regain control of the regions they had held before Shi Huangdi. They raised armies and fought over territory. During the civil war that followed, two powerful leaders emerged. Xiang Yu was an artistic general who was willing to allow the warlords to keep their territories if they would acknowledge him as their feudal lord, and Liu Bang was one of Xiang Yu's generals. Eventually, Liu Bang turned against Xiang Yu. The two fought their final battle in 202 BC. Liu Bang won and declared himself the first emperor of the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty, which ruled China for more than 400 years, is divided into two periods. The former Han ruled for about 2 centuries until about AD 9. After a brief period when the Han were out of power, the later Han ruled for almost another 2 centuries. The Han dynasty so influenced China that even today many Chinese call themselves people of the Han. Liu Bang's first goal was to destroy the rival king's power. He followed Shi Huangdi's policy of establishing a centralized government in which a central authority, the king, controls the running of the state. Reporting to Liu Bang's central government were hundreds of local provincials called commanderies. To win popular support, Liu Bang departed from Shi Huangdi's strict legalism. He lowered taxes and softened harsh punishment. People throughout the empire appreciated the peace and stability that Liu Bang brought to China. When Liu Bang died in 195 BC, his son became emperor, but in name only. The real ruler was his mother, Empress Liu. Although Liu had not been Liu Bang's only wife, she had powerful friends at court who helped her seize power. The empress outlived her son and retained control of the throne by naming first one infant and then another as emperor. Because the infants were too young to rule, she remained in control. When Empress Liu died in 180 BC, people who remained loyal to Liu Bang's family, rather than the Liu's family, came back into power. They rid the palace of the old empress's relatives by executing them. Such palace plots occurred often throughout the Han dynasty. Traditionally, the emperor chose the favorite among his wives as the empress and appointed one of her sons as successor. Because of this, the palace women and their families competed fiercely for the emperor's notice. The families would make alliances with influential people in the court. The resulting power plays distracted the emperor and his officials so much that they sometimes could not govern efficiently. When Liu Bang's great-grandson took the throne, he continued Liu Bang's centralized policies. Wudi, who reigned from 141 to 87 BC, held the throne longer than any other Han emperor. He is called the martial emperor because he adopted the policy of expanding the Chinese empire throughout war. Wudi's first set of enemies were the Xiongnu, fierce nomads known for their deadly archery skills from horseback. The Xiongnu roamed the steppes to the north and west of China. They made raids into China's settled farmland. There they took hostages and stole grain, livestock, and other valuable items. The early Han emperors tried to buy off the Xiongnu by sending them thousands of pounds of silk, rice, alcohol, and money. Usually, the Xiongnu just accepted these gifts and continued their raids. When Wudi realized that the bribes were simply making the Xiongnu stronger, he sent more than 100,000 soldiers to fight them. To help defeat the Xiongnu, Wudi also made alliances of their enemies. After his army forced the nomads to retreat into Central Asia, Wudi attempted to make his northwest border safe by settling his troops on the Xiongnu's former pastures. Although this tactic succeeded for a time, nomadic raiders continued to cause problems during much of China's later history. Wudi also colonized areas to the northeast, now known as Manchuria, and Korea. He sent his armies south, where they conquered mountain tribes and set up Chinese colonies all the way into what is now Vietnam. By the end of Wudi's reign, the empire had expanded nearly to the bounds of present-day China. Chinese society under the Han Dynasty was highly structured. Just as Han emperors tried to control the people they conquered, they exerted vast control over the Chinese themselves. Because the Chinese believed their emperor to have divine authority, they accepted his exercise of power. He was the link between heaven and earth. If the emperor did his job well, China had peace and prosperity. If he failed, the heavens showed their displeasure with earthquakes, floods, and famines. However, the emperor did not rule alone. The Chinese emperor relied on a complex bureaucracy to help him rule. Running the bureaucracy and maintaining the imperial army were expensive. To raise money, the government levied taxes. Like the farmers in India, Chinese peasants owed part of their yearly crops to the government. Merchants also paid taxes. Besides taxes, the peasants owed the government a month's worth of labor or military service every year. With this source of labor, the Han emperors built roads and dug canals and irrigation ditches. The emperors also filled the ranks of China's vast armies and expanded the Great Wall, which stretched across the northern frontier. Wudi's government employed more than 130,000 people. The bureaucracy included 18 different ranks of civil service jobs, which were government jobs that civilians obtained by taking examinations. At times, Chinese emperors rewarded loyal followers with government posts. However, another way to fill government posts evolved under the Han. This method involved testing applicants' knowledge of Confucianism, the teaching of Confucius, who had lived 400 years before. That's fortune cookie knowledge, guys. The early Han emperors had employed some Confucian scholars as court advisors, but it was Wudi who began actively to favor them. Confucius had taught that gentlemen should practice reverence or respect, generosity, truthfulness, diligence, and kindness, because these were exactly the qualities he wanted his government officials to have. Wudi set up a school where hopeful job applicants from all over China could come to study Confucius's work. After their studies, job applicants took formal examinations in history, law, literature, and Confucianism. In theory, anyone could take the exams. In practice, few peasants could afford to educate their sons, so only sons of wealthy landowners had a chance at a government career. In spite of this flaw, the civil service system began by Wudi worked so efficiently that it continued in China until 1912. The 400 years of Han rule saw not only improvements in education, but also great advances in Chinese technology and culture. In addition, the centralized government began to exert more control over commerce and manufacturing. Advances in technology included all aspects of Chinese life. Paper was invented in AD 105. Before that, books were usually written on silk, but paper was cheaper, so books became more readily available. This helped spread education in China. The invention of paper also affected Chinese government. Formerly, all government documents had been recorded on strips of wood. Paper was much more convenient to use for record keeping, so Chinese bureaucracy expanded. Another technological advance was the collar harness for horses. This invention allowed horses to pull much heavier loads than did the harness being used in Europe at that time. The Chinese perfected a plow that was more efficient because it had two blades. They also improved iron tools, invented the wheelbarrow, and began to use water mills to grind grain. During the Han Dynasty, the population of China swelled to 60 million. Because there were so many people to feed, Confucian scholars and ordinary Chinese people considered agriculture the most important and honored occupation. An imperial edict written in 167 BC stated this philosophy quite plainly. Agriculture is the foundation of the world. No duty is greater. Although the same decree dismissed commerce as the least important occupation, manufacturing and commerce were actually very important to the Han Empire. The government established monopolies of the mining of salt, the forging of iron, the minting of coins, and the brewing of alcohol. A monopoly occurs when a group has exclusive control over the production and distribution of certain goods. For a time, the government also ran huge silk mills, competing with private silk weavers in making the luxurious cloth. As contact with people from other lands increased, the Chinese realized how valuable their silk was as an item of trade. Because of this, the techniques of silk production became a closely guarded state secret. Spurred by the worldwide demand for silk, Chinese commerce expanded along the Silk Roads to most of Asia and throughout India, all the way to Rome. As the Han Empire expanded its trade network, the Chinese began to learn about foods and fashions common in foreign lands. Similarly, expanding the empire through the conquest brought people of different cultures under Chinese rule. To unify the empire, the Chinese government encouraged assimilation, the process of making conquered peoples part of Chinese culture. To promote assimilation, the government sent Chinese farmers to settle newly colonized areas. It also encouraged them to intermarry with local peoples. Government officials set up schools to train local people in the Confucian philosophy and then appointed local scholars to government posts. Several writers also helped to unify Chinese culture by recording China's history. Sima Qian, who lived from 145 to 85 BC, is called the Grand Historian for his work in compiling a history of China from the ancient dynasties to Wudi. To write accurately, Sima Qian visited historical sites, interviewed eyewitnesses, researched official records, and examined artifacts. His book is called Records of the Grand Historian. Another famous book was the history of the former Han dynasty. Ban Biao, who lived from AD 3 to 54, started the project. After his death, his son Ban Gu and later his daughter Ban Zhao worked on it. Ban Zhao also wrote a guide called Lessons for Women, which called upon women to be humble and obedient, but also industrious. Although Ban Zhao gained fame as a historian, most women during the Han Dynasty led quiet lives at home. Confucian teachings had dictated that women were to devote themselves to their families. However, women made important contributions to their family's economic life through duties in the home and work in the fields of the family farm. Some upper class women lived much different lives. As explained earlier, a few empresses wielded great power. Taoist and later Buddhist nuns were able to gain an education and lead lives apart from their families. Women in aristocratic and land-owning families also sometimes pursued education and culture. Some women ran small shops, still others practiced medicine. In spite of economic and cultural advances, the Han emperors faced grave problems. One of the main problems was an economic imbalance caused by customs that allowed the rich to gain more wealth at the expense of the poor. According to the custom, a family's land was divided equally among all of the father's male heirs. Unless a farmer could afford to buy more land during his lifetime, each generation inherited smaller plots. With such small plots of land, farmers had a hard time raising enough food to sell or even to feed their family. Because of this, small farmers often went into debt and had to borrow money from large landowners who charged very high interest rates. If the farmer couldn't pay back the debt, the landowner took possession of the farmer's land. Large landowners were not required, to pay taxes. So when their land holdings increased, the amount of the land that was left for the government to tax decreased. With less money coming in, the government pressed harder to collect money from the smaller farmers. As a result, the gap between rich and poor increased. During this time of economic change, political instability grew. At the palace, court advisors, palace servants, and rival influential families wove complex plots to influence the emperor's choice of who would succeed him as ruler. From about 32 BC until AD 9, one inexperienced emperor replaced another. Chaos reigned in the palace, and with peasants' revolts, unrest spread across the land as well. Finally, Wang Mang, a Confucian scholar and member of the court, decided that a strong ruler was needed to restore order. For 6 years, he had been acting as a regent for the infant who had been crowned emperor. In AD 9, Wang Mang took the imperial title for himself and overthrew the Han, thus ending the former Han, the first half of the Han dynasty. Wang Mang tried to bring the country under control. He minted new money to relieve the treasury shortage and set up a public granaries to help feed China's poor. Wang Mang also took away large landownings from the rich and planned to redistribute the land to farmers who had lost their land. But this plan angered powerful landholders. Wang Mang's larger supply of money disrupted the economy because it allowed people to increase their spending, which encouraged merchants to raise prices. Then, in AD 11, a great flood left thousands dead and millions homeless. The public granaries did not hold enough to feed the displaced, starving people. Huge peasants' revolts rocked the land. The wealthy opposed the Wang Mang's land policies, joined in the rebellion. The rebels assassinated Wang Mang in AD 23. Within 2 years, a member of the old imperial family took the throne and began the second period of Han rule called the Later Han. With peace restored in China, the first decades of the later Han dynasty were quite prosperous. The government sent soldiers and merchants westward to regain control of posts along the Silk Roads. But this expansion could not hold up for a social, political, and economic weakness within the empire itself. Within a century, China suffered from the same economic imbalances, political intrigues, and social unrest that had toppled the former Han. By 220, the later Han dynasty had disintegrated into three rival kingdoms.